1. Clementine. Dr. Clementine Hughes did not deserve this. He could feel the blood pulsing through the neck of the lab technician who sat 3 desks away from him. His gaze yanked to the exposed veins on her wrist as she tapped her pen. As though his fangs had a mind of their own, the venomous canines slipped free. He retracted them in a panic. The few humans lingering in their research lab's communal office space seemed not to notice. This time. It had been 3 months since Clementine turned, and with each slip-up he was more and more certain someone would take note. When they did, he could only hope that they killed him before they tried to fire him. That sounded like a much nicer progression. No severance pay, but at least he'd never have to tell his parents that Vitalis-Barron Pharmaceuticals, front-runner in medical research and therapeutics, had sacked him, just as they were considering his promotion to their microbiome department's senior research associate. Clementine ran his tongue over his front teeth. No more fangs, thankfully, and tried to ignore the lab tech as she walked behind him. He held his breath. She passed by. He exhaled. And his fangs slipped out again. Damn it. Clementine didn't know much about vampires, but he knew he didn't deserve to be one. The first few days had been a waking nightmare of pain and sweats. Many people died during the transition, but after living through it, he was pretty sure he had died. That was where the myth of the undead vampire came from, he was certain. He had died, and this was hell. Except Clem was also certain that in the real afterlife he wouldn't be having quite this hard of a time, seeing how he'd done absolutely nothing wrong in his entire life. That wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't delusion. Dr. Clementine Hughes, Chemist of the Year, potential Nobel Prize winner, secret writer of 5 million words of slow-burning, emotionally smutty and incredibly gay Star Trek fanfic, had exerted a great deal of energy in order to live this perfect a life. And now, his meticulously sculpted existence was falling apart around him, because of a tiny, itty-bitty disaster, one that hadn't even been his fault. He was pretty sure about that. He'd analyzed it 50 times already that evening, and after another 50, he was prepared to bump pretty sure up to mostly sure before the whole process started again tomorrow. It hadn't been his fault, right? When he could remember so little of what had happened to him, it was hard to be certain. "Clementine!" Clem flinched so hard that his vampiric strength knocked his chair into his desk. Dr. Anthony Hilker leaned toward Clem's shoulder, watching him with his brow raised. The man had his blazer slung over an arm, and his brown hair was pulled up in a bun today, revealing his undercut and the long slope of his neck. Blood pulsed faintly beneath the skin there, but Clementine's general annoyance with Anthony made it a bit easier for him to drag his gaze upward. A few wisps of gray were growing at his temples. Clementine hadn't even turned 30 yet, and he already swore he was finding some silver mixed with his own hair, though the natural gold of his curls did a better job of hiding it. Working for this company seemed to have an aging effect on people. Or perhaps that was simply the result of fighting for promotions against Anthony's aggressive enthusiasm. Clem forced a smile. "Good evening, Anthony." "You're in... what is this, early for you?" Anthony wrinkled his nose. "I still can't believe you've shifted so many of your hours to a night schedule. That would wreak havoc on my ability to sleep." The fact that their level of the lab sat 2 stories underground was the only reason Clementine could stand the few day shifts he'd kept, and even then he had to time his coming and going to avoid direct sunlight. "The empty lab helps me think," Clem replied. "Dr. Blood approves of it. She suggested we form a full night team. It would be almost like having 2 labs running without the need to build a second location." Anthony's eyes tightened. That sounds capitalistic, but I can't imagine Vitalis-Barron would implement it. It would make it far too easy for vampires to slip into our midst.
We could use it as a new hunting tactic.
Natalie de Leon wrapped an arm around Anthony's neck as she slipped in behind him, her chin tucked against his shoulder like a rabid PDA announcement.
Lure them in with a job offer, and don't let them back out again.
A tremble worked itself up Clementine's spine at the thought of the secret, lowest level of their research complex's underground labs, the basement, where they kept the vampires they used in very specific and very secretive parts of their research. Vampires who looked like they were inches from death, hollow-eyed and locked in cages. Vampires who people from Natalie's team had gently pressured into volunteering for the cause. Vampires, like Clementine. He'd always known that some of their microbio projects used compounds produced by vampires, but he'd assumed they were acquired on a more ethical basis, until Vitalis-Barron had recently deemed him worthy of visiting the basement lab. There was nothing technically illegal about using vampires as lab rats, not when lawyers could argue that the research ethics laws currently in place were written specifically for humans. None of it would have sat right with Clementine even before he'd turned. But now the chance of getting another job anywhere half as respectable, with a quarter of the paycheck, would be out of the question. One daytime interview in a well-lit room, and they'd ushered him out the door, like his painful sun-induced shakes were contagious. No more respectable job, no more apartment, no more family approval, no more life. He just had to keep his head down and his work consistent and hope that no one noticed his fangs. Nat, Anthony cooed at his girlfriend. He was too old for her, and the feigned childishness made it even more obvious. Don't tell me you're bored already. She waggled the tip of her dark braid against Anthony's lips.
Not bored, just frustrated. I think I have a lead, though, finally. Some vampire who's been helping the two who murdered Matthew. If I can get my hands on them.
And then you'll be ready to let this vengeance nonsense go?
Then I'll have closure.
Natalie pecked him on the cheek. The mark of her red lipstick remained on his skin like a brand.
And the boss will be happy. The basement is low on subjects again.
Clementine tried to roll his chair away, staring anywhere but the woman's neck. Our research on vampires is at the forefront of modern science. He repeated the line from their tour, trying to beam pro-vampire torture from every cell of his being. I'm not sure we can claim we're truly progressing our pharmaceutical research when everything we do is based solely on where the money is, Anthony put in, playing with Nat's braid. How much more would we learn if we stopped caring whether anything turned a profit and instead followed the science, wherever it led?
Right now the science is leading me back to the lab, Clementine replied, scooting his chair further away from the incessant lovebirds. If you would excuse me. As he tried to leave, Anthony called after him.
You heard about the break-ins at our blood bank, right? The slightly darker, entirely unhuman blood in Clem's veins went cold. Yeah, the man continued, as though Clem had acknowledged him. Apparently someone's been stealing from it, maybe for months. They're putting up cameras now.
Are they? Cameras?
Clementine's voice sounded distant to his own ears, echoing back at him across a great plain of his own panic.
Good on them.
Good on them? Those couldn't have been his words. Fuck it. He needed to get out of here. But more than that, he needed to work, because taking his shifts at night without the rest of his team had already put him behind on his current projects. And if what Anthony had said was true, and his bagged blood supply was suddenly disappearing on him, he would have to find a new source. Most likely, a live one. Clem ended up in the bathroom, both hands pressed to the back of a locked stall as he focused on breathing. Through extensive tracking of his own consumption, he'd deduced that a moderately sized adult vampire, such as himself, was meant to drink approximately 44 milliliters,
a shot glass, hilariously, of blood a day. But for the past month he'd been trying to hide his stealing by diluting his intake down to half that, as though he might wean himself off the horrid stuff entirely. Which wasn't actually possible. He assumed. It wasn't as though he had anyone to ask, exactly. The only real vampires he'd ever seen outside the news had been the ones locked in cells and strapped to tables 3 floors beneath him. But just setting foot on that level would raise the entire building's alarms, since the bizarre break-in shortly after Clem was turned. There had been a vampire in the lab then, too. A vampire who was healthy and strong, who had held his human partner's wrist and leaned toward his ear without his gaze catching on the man's neck even once. An escaped new arrival, perhaps? Or a thief? Clementine should have run after him. He'd been too slow on the uptake, too convinced that the nightmare of his vampirism would somehow work itself out, that since he didn't deserve this, it would have to go away. But it hadn't. He shoved the bathroom wall with a muffled growl. The tile cracked beneath the pressure. Cracked, like him, for reasons beyond his control. Undeserved. 30 minutes later, he finally returned to the now much quieter office space. He put his headphones in, blasting the soothing tones of orchestral metal into his skull, and threw on a lab coat, descending into work until everything else faded away. By the time he collected his leather satchel and donned his tweed coat, the 7 a.m. lab staff were already arriving with coffee and yawns. He checked the sky for the first signs of dawn as he stepped out into the dark winter morning. The air was unusually chilly, a mid-30s that might almost have brought snow, if the precipitation would ever make its way past the white-capped eastern mountains. 3 months ago, it would have made him tug up his collar and hurry to the car. But since turning, he never felt particularly cold. Instead, he tugged up his collar in an attempt to block the appetizing scent of the incoming wave of staff, and hurried to the car to keep any of them from trying to talk to him. As he slipped inside his electric sedan, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He hated those. Hated how disconnected they felt. How the participants were expected to understand the full scope of emotion being conveyed without any facial or body language cues, and worse, to convey their own emotions back using tone of voice alone. Even the best calls left him feeling tired and jittery. He almost tossed his phone over the obnoxious beach umbrella that took up his center console, an emergency precaution he hadn't had to use yet. But the caller ID stopped him. His sister couldn't wait. Family was a priority, at least in his family, alongside the priorities of financial growth, academic acclaim, and all-around prestige. Clem hit answer a moment too late and cursed as he struggled to call Odysseus back while turning on the car. Its Bluetooth clicked over, Odysseus's voice booming out as clearly as though the woman was in the vehicle with him. "Clementine, honey, is this not a good time? I can call back." "Sissy, hey." He raised his voice, then regretted it as his sister audibly recoiled. Softer, he added, No, this is fine. Do you need something?" "Need something." Clem cringed. That was too forward. Pushy, even. Odysseus sighed. "No, yes, it's just Reggie. He's coming back into town next month, and I thought we'd throw him a little thing." A little thing had also been Sissy's way of describing the New Year's party she'd hosted last week. A 500-guest gala with a 7-course meal and a $1 million charity raffle. Between that and heading a prestigious law firm, she had covered everything her family could possibly want from her. And here was her younger brother, secretly dreading the fact that a promotion to senior associate would take him further away from the mundanity of routine lab duties and feeling burnt to hell and back from the few hours he'd spent at his family's holiday functions. "Oh, just a little thing, then." As he said it, he realized he'd sounded not only pushy, but annoyed, too. In person, he could have smiled it off, but now he was stuck. Would an "I'm just joking" work? Suddenly he couldn't recall if that was a thing people did. The other end of the phone went quiet for a moment. "Are you all right, Clem?" What a day. "Yes, fine, I'm great." Clem tried his best to grit his teeth and beam through the phone. "Dr. Blood is thinking of taking up my idea of a full night shift, and the drug we pushed to clinical trials last month is already giving us positive results. Which of the many drugs you won't tell me about is this?" "Alas, I am sworn to secrecy." "Still afraid I might steal your compounds for my law practice?" "I just hope you never have to prosecute us." Clem finally pulled out of his Associate of the Year parking space, but all he could think of were Vitalis-Barron cells full of vampires. If only they'd let him keep his phone during that tour. Sissy laughed, all sparkling wine and biting logic. "Why, I'd never! Conflict of interest! But you had better be working on something for my poor wrinkles. I'm 37 and I look like the Grim Reaper, not even the hot boy toy version. It's disgusting." Odysseus had presented as a hot boy toy version of herself for most of her life, but the last 5 years she'd finally transitioned into a literal goddess instead. Their parents had initially put on a show of distress, but once Sissy proved that she was just as capable a businesswoman and lawyer as she had been while using her birth-assigned pronouns, they had grudgingly offered support. Really, Clem figured none of them should have been so shocked when the sibling who'd feminized what their parents had always claimed was a gender-neutral Odysseus into Sissy had turned out to be a girl. And it was like the universe had programmed itself to fit her needs ahead of time. Clem cringed. That was too harsh of him. The universe had put his sister through a fair helping of emotional and surgical trauma to get her to this place. But he still envied how optimistically and effortlessly she handled it all. "Unfortunately, no," he replied. "But we are working on a pill that takes away the headaches your old, decrepit sister gives you, and I plan to get a lot of use out of it." "You are such a hoot," Sissy chortled. "Now, I have hot yoga to catch and a client at 9:30. You sleep well, Clem. Bye-bye." The call ended before he could give his own farewell, which was for the best since it sat a little sour on his tongue. At least this way he didn't have to deal with the eternally awkward back and forth of how many goodbyes is appropriate and trying to figure out who should be the one to hang up. As he pulled past the parking lot security gate with a wave, his gaze caught on the guard's neck. He swore he could see the blood pounding beneath her skin, calling to him. His stomach ached like a black hole, and his fangs slipped free with such force that he had to struggle to pull them back in. He could feel his empty fridge taunting him already. His last stolen blood bag finished this morning. Before he left for work next, he'd have to find a new source of blood, or else risk sinking his fangs into his Vitalis-Barron coworkers, which meant that Dr. Clementine Hughes, faltering phenomenon and broken vampire, would have to hunt his first human tonight. 2. Justin. Justin Yu deserved this. He had done such a significant number of things wrong in his life that he'd lost track, and now he was finally paying back his debt. There was, at least, no better community to be indebted to. The 14 square blocks that composed Alisanto were his home, and he had no desire to be free of them. He loved the cracked pavement where the little weedy yellow flowers would pop up in the spring. He loved the tired apartment buildings sitting atop little old shops, weathered from years of life and love, but still just as personable and unique as the day they'd first opened. The balconies above them draped in overgrown potted plants and a colorful array of flags with the occasional rope of drying laundry. He loved the chipped stucco and the murals that had been coated one atop another every decade since the walls had been built. And he loved that the little scattered graveyards tucked into the alleys and side streets were old enough to hold the immigrant great-grandparents of the people still cooking their family recipes and celebrating their traditions. He was even a little fond of the smell. Every kind of grime mixed with the lingering wafts of frying oil and spices.
It was the oldest and often the roughest part of San Salud, but it was, and always would be, home. After the hell he'd put it through in his youth, he owed it this penance. Which was why, as the chronic pain between his shoulder blades mounted at the end of a long day of odd jobs, instead of returning to his apartment, he perched himself atop the large angel monument at the front of the micro-cemetery that felt more like home to him than his own apartment. He sat on the statue's shoulder, one leg lounging over its side, and the other tucked against its unfurled wing. The individual feathers had been sculpted out in perfect detail once, but now most of them bled together, chipped and worn. He related to that. As he smoked his back pain away with long puffs of his custom under-the-counter drug blend, he scanned the area for anything amiss. The sky was just darkening to purple, the old lamps from the main street casting everything they touched in a slightly golden hue, while the alley, with its eternally broken lighting, remained dark and haunting. For the moment, everything seemed quiet. Everything except the constant buzz from his phone. He swiped open the top string of text messages. Isaiah. God, I forgot how much I hate trains. I know they're more efficient and America should build a bunch of them, but they're consistently overloud or weirdly quiet, and people eat food in your presence. Hello, Batman, are you reading this? Activating bat signal now. I would just like my misery acknowledged, that's all. Justin. LMAO, you're so getting off on this. You know, I was tempted to not answer and see how long it takes your attention deficit to break my phone. Isaiah. You are so rude. And please don't kink-shame me. You know I get off on that, too. Justin refrained from continuing the gag for both their sakes, but mostly Isaiah's. It wasn't fair to joke about the things they both knew Justin could never actually offer him. Isaiah. I suppose flying comes with most of the same cons, but at least it would have been faster, and Priscilla was willing to pay. Justin. But they wouldn't have let you bring your blood, and I don't want you burning up in the sun if your plane gets delayed. Isaiah. Yeah, I do suppose that might have been a little bit inconvenient. Justin. So, how was the wedding? Isaiah. It was nice, pretty chill. The cake looked magnificent. I took so many pictures. Priscilla also looked good. I have lots of those pictures as well. James was fine, I suppose. Totally average. I still think Priscilla could have done better. Believing Priscilla could do better was ironic, coming from the vampire who couldn't seem to accept that Justin wasn't worth his dedication. Soft and strong and more beautiful than was probably good for him, Isaiah could have had anyone. And Justin desperately wished he wouldn't waste his time pining for the worst option imaginable. Justin had gone a decade without dating, and he'd keep that trend going as long as his neighborhood stood. His vampires walking the streets at night, and his debt to them eternally unfulfilled. Isaiah. I miss you, though, my tall, dark, and lonely. Justin's heart broke at the line. No one else would have called him lonely. No one else knew him that well. Dark, probably. Bitter, angry, intense, absolutely. For all the penance he paid Alisanta, and all they eagerly accepted from him, that darkness still remained. Maybe that was why the neighborhood could call his name in greeting and welcome him to their tables after he'd filled their fridges and cleaned up their streets, and he still felt like there was an invisible wall between himself and them. Despite their love and forgiveness, they were first and foremost the people he'd hurt in his youth, and their community was all that remained of the leader he'd taken from them. He had to make up for that before anything else. Justin. Missing you too, Toll. He threw in the platonic Tagalog term of affection at the end for good measure, though he suspected that by now, if Isaiah hadn't taken his hints, and more explicit denials, to heart, there was a chance he never would. Justin. How are things going with your new suburban friends, Wes and Vincent? Isaiah.
Changing the topic on me, I see. It's not going anywhere since A, I haven't been home, and B, they have some asshole hunter who's trying to get to them through their contacts, so they're staying away from other vampires whenever possible right now. Besides, I was mostly just finding them vamps to offer their spare room to, which the hunter is complicating anyway. Justin. That sucks. Keep me informed about the hunter, though. If they come poking around here, I'll send them packing. As he sent the message, 3 college-age teens slipped into the wide alley, looking shifty as they nudged each other. They huddled around the bike rack on the corner, 2 of them standing guard while the last knelt with a pair of pliers. One of them wore a shirt with the logo of the city's tiny but somehow still obnoxiously loud anti-vampire group. They weren't his neighborhood kids. Justin would have recognized them if they were, and they would have known better than to try this kind of shit. And they would have known to look up. Justin. BRB found some punks. Isaiah. Don't you dare, Batman, please. You need to take a break already. Next time our friends get married, you're going to come with me, even if I have to half-drain you and smuggle you onto a train in a duffel bag. Don't think I won't do it. Justin stopped reading, quietly sliding his phone back into his pocket. His joint had dimmed his usual nerve-tingling pain back down to a low, ignorable ache. It flared between his shoulder blades as he stretched out his back, highlighting the gnarled tissue around his spine, like he was some mythical fallen angel with severed wings. Symbolic, really. "Faster!" one of the watching teens snapped. Her kneeling companion scowled. "The blade's dull." Justin stubbed out his joint and carefully perched the remaining coil of it in the angel's cupped palms. He leaped to the alleyway pavement, his black boots scuffing on the worn cement. A fresh flare of pain attacked his back as he straightened, but he grimaced through it. Hooking both thumbs into his pockets, he barked, "I think that's quite enough." The gazes of the 3 teens snapped toward him. He made one hell of a sight in the waning light, he knew. His dark hair swept back from his tight, monolid eyes, and his plethora of tattoos peeking out from the collar of his ripped denim jacket and descending across the back of his knuckles. He'd considered buying a mask just for these interactions. A cape, too, maybe. Subtlety was not his style. As the teenagers watched, he circled around them like a stalking tiger, scanning them up and down. Now, I'm not against all theft. Some people have so much more than they need they won't even notice. Justin knew the people who owned these bikes couldn't replace them so easily. Ty had saved up for that black sporty one for 6 months so he could ride it out to the lake to sketch the birds. And Roberto's rickety pink thing might have been a hand-me-down from his boyfriend's sister, but the collection of pride stickers he'd covered it with was all his. Justin himself had pitched in to buy the blue one for Anna Lee, the vampiric single mother of 4 who worked in the back of the Chinese bakery across the street. "But if you steal from Alisanta," he said, "it'll be the last thing you ever take." The teenagers should have run. Most kids from the surrounding neighborhoods would have. But not these, wielding their Caucasian ancestry and designer labels like shields as their expressions hardened. The teen with the dull chain cutter lifted it like a weapon. "Don't come any closer!" From the other end of the dim alley came a sound like a breathless curse. Justin ignored it. "Some kind of initiation, is this? Or do you think you're being cool?" He was baiting them, of course. But some habits died hard. Died like vampires, taking you down with them, bite after bleeding bite. The punk with the anti-vampire shirt stormed forward like he was reenacting a scene from a movie, his grip on his chain cutter too high and tight, his feet too close together and his chin lifted in a way that was all ignorant courage. Justin stepped lazily to the side and knocked the kid across the jaw with his elbow. He tried not to put the full force of his considerable strength behind it, but he didn't try particularly hard. The punk toppled to his knees, and Justin shoved him back with a firm nudge from the ball of his foot.
The space between his shoulder blades shrieked at him for that, but he'd appease it with the rest of his joint shortly. All three